Hey gents, Idaho here. Take a look at any list of the worst aircraft of World War II. There's a pretty high probability that the plane at the very top of that list is the Brewster Buffalo, the flying coffin of the Battle of Midway, the plane so outclassed by its opponents that one pilot said that anyone sent into battle in it should be considered as lost before they even left the ground. But what if I told you that the fighter with the best kill-to-loss ratio of any aircraft in World War II was the Brewster Buffalo? That's right, not the F4U Corsair with its 11 to 1 kill to loss ratio, not even my personal favorite F6F Hellcat at 19 to 1, but the lowly, tubby Brewster Buffalo. Or at least one particular model of the Buffalo, the B239 export version for Finland, which achieved an amazing 26 to 1 kill to loss ratio. Now, we're more familiar with the story of the Buffalo as one of the worst flops of the war, a plane whose most significant mark in history is its awful performance at the Battle of Midway. So how is it that half a world away, but at the very same time, the Finns were racking up kill after kill with the same plane? Let's dive in. In the 1930s, aviation was progressing at a breakneck pace. Aircraft were designed, produced, and became obsolete within 3 years. Over the course of that decade, the state of the art advanced from open cockpits and fixed landing gear and fabric control surfaces and wired and strap bracing to closed cockpits, retractable gear, aluminum alloy skin, and cantilever wings. The rate of change was so fast that the Navy issued a request for proposals in 1935 for the replacement for the Grumman F-3F before the F-3F had even entered operational service. Three manufacturers submitted proposals for that replacement aircraft: Seversky with a navalized P-35, Grumman with what would eventually become the Wildcat, and Brewster with what would go on to become the Buffalo. Grumman and Brewster were both awarded a contract to deliver a prototype for evaluation. Brewster's design was the favored winner, but the Navy, wisely as it turned out, didn't fully trust Brewster to deliver, so they kept Grumman in their back pocket just in case. That was smart. Brewster became legendary for its incompetence during World War II. Mismanaged factories, crazy union strikes, salesmen who milked the company of its profits, financial mismanagement at the very top, and other scandals meant that Brewster was eventually relegated by the Navy to build Champsfott's Corsair on a license contract. They built over 700 Corsairs during the war, but their reputation for poor quality workmanship meant those Corsairs were kept away from the front lines, and Brewster was so consistently late with Corsair deliveries that the Navy canceled their contract in June of 1944. The company didn't survive that blow. Back in 1938, though, Brewster was still an opportunistic young upstart, and though they delivered the Buffalo prototype a year late, that didn't hurt their chances. In the 1938 fly-off, the Buffalo beat the Wildcat in every category except marginally top speed. Brewster got the contract, and Grumman went back to the drawing board. In 1939, Brewster started delivering the first production variant, the F2A1, to the Navy. The F2A1 had a 950 horsepower Wright R1820-34 engine with a 2-speed supercharger, a top speed of 268 miles an hour at sea level and 301 miles an hour at 17,000 feet, and a stunning initial climb rate of 3,800 feet per minute, with a 2,700 feet per minute average up to 15,000 feet. Its armament consisted of one 50 caliber and one 30 caliber machine guns centrally mounted and firing through the prop, with an additional 50 caliber machine gun in each wing. The contract called for 54 aircraft, but only 11 were delivered before the Navy stopped taking deliveries of the F-2A1 in favor of the newly upgraded F-2A2. In 1940 and 1941, 43 models of the F-2A2 were delivered to the Navy, and 8 of the original 11 F-2A1s were converted to F-2A2s. The F-2A2 had a Wright R1820-40 engine running at 1,200 horsepower, with a larger propeller than the F-2A1, for a substantial increase in top speed to 290 miles an hour at sea level and 344 miles an hour at 17,000 feet. The F-2A2's climb rate was almost identical to the F-2A1, with a very small decrease in initial climb rate, more than reversed by 40-second improvement in the time it took to reach 15,000 feet, which the F-2A2 could do in just under 5 minutes. Meanwhile, the armament was slightly upgraded by swapping the prop-firing 30 caliber machine gun for a forced 50 caliber. Though you wouldn't expect it based on the Buffalo's tubby looks, the F-2A1 and the F-2A2 were surprisingly nimble. The F-2A1's wing loading was 24.2 pounds per square foot, and the F-2A2's was 25.9. By comparison, the A6M20's wing loading was 24.3 pounds per square foot, almost exactly the same as the F-2A1. Pappy Boyington is reported to have said that the early model Buffaloes could turn and roll in a phone booth, and the famed British pilot Eric Brown said that the F-2A1 had delightful maneuverability. The plane was light, reasonably powered for its weight, and capable of some impressive aerobatic maneuvering. However, Eric Brown's next comment, literally in the same breath, was that the F-2A1 had, quote, poor fighter performance. There's more to a fighter than maneuverability, after all. Combat reports from Europe in 1939 were already beginning to show the inevitable superiority of aircraft that emphasized top speed, armament, and armor. Though the F-2A2 was roughly equal in top speed to the A6M20 and the Spitfire Mark II, the writing was on the wall. To keep up with trends, the Buffalo would need to be upgraded. The new F-2A3 model would receive additional fuel, armor, and ammunition. And that's where it all fell apart. Adding fuel, armor, and ammo was a good idea in theory, but in practice, the airframe and power plant were just unable to accept those changes and still maintain performance. As a result, the F-2A3 was a frankly miserable aircraft. First, in an effort to increase range, so important over the Pacific, the plane's fuel capacity was increased from 160 gallons to 240 gallons. A 40-gallon tank was inserted beneath the pilot, and a 20-gallon tank was added to the leading edge of each wing. The result was a range of 1,980 miles, up from 1,610 in the F-2A2. But this increased weight dramatically. The weight increased even further when 124 pounds of armor plating were added, as well as extra ammunition for the 450 caliber machine guns. All told, the gross weight of the F-2A3 increased by over 1,000 pounds from the F-2A2, and almost 1,500 pounds from the F-2A1, to a total of 6,500 pounds. Top speed dropped by 22 miles an hour to 322 miles an hour at 16,000 feet and 284 miles an hour at sea level. The climb rate dropped by 800 feet per minute in the initial climb, and the time to 15,000 feet dropped from 5 minutes to 7, for a pokey average climb rate of about 2,100 feet per minute up to that altitude. Wing loading increased to 31.1 pounds per square foot. This is closer to the narrow-winged BF-109 Emil than it is to the Zero, but the Buffalo was significantly heavier than the 109 and so lacked its vertical capabilities. That wasn't even the end of the bad news. In dive tests, the F-2A3 was found to have poor lateral control. To solve this, the throw of the ailerons was reduced from a total of 42.5 degrees across their range to only 27.5 degrees, which impacted the maximum roll rate in combat. It was this awful F-2A3, hand-me-downs from the Navy, that the Marines found themselves flying at Midway. Underpowered for its weight, sluggish, with a wing loading significantly higher than the Zero, the Buffalo was eviscerated by the lighter, faster Japanese fighters. 19 Marine Buffaloes took off to defend the island. Only 5 returned. After the battle, Marine Captain Philip White wrote bitterly, "The F-2A3 is not a combat aircraft. It is inferior to the planes we are fighting in every respect. It is my belief that any commander that orders pilots out for combat in an F-2A3 should consider the pilot as lost before leaving the ground." Charles Hughes described watching 2 Buffaloes fighting Zeros. One was shot down and the other was saved by ground fire covering his tail. Both looked like they were tied to a string while the Zeros made passes at them. I believe that our men with planes even half as good as the Zeros would have stopped the raid completely. Marine Charles Kunz, who would end the war with 8 kills, said, "I think the Zero is probably one of the finest fighters in the present war. As for the F-2A3, or Brewster Trainer, it should be in Miami as a training plane rather than be used as a first-line fighter." At this point, due to Brewster's production problems, the Buffalo had already been replaced on Navy carriers by its erstwhile backup, an improved version of the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, which performed a little bit better than the F-2A3 overall, especially at higher altitudes. The Buffalo's high altitude performance was largely theoretical, as its engine had starvation issues that were never ironed out. The Marine Corps quickly replaced their Buffaloes, and the plane would never see another major action in American hands. It should be noted, though, that Grumman and the Navy repeated the mistakes that Brewster and the Navy had made with the F-2A3 by over-upgrading the F-4F-4. It was not the Wildcat itself, but developing American tactics that enabled the Americans to go toe-to-toe with the Zero, particularly the practice of flying and supporting 2 ship elements in which each Wildcat could defend the other from the more maneuverable Zeros, and the doctrine of not dogfighting with Zeros, but instead flying high and diving and extending after passes. The Wildcat broke even with the Zero through teamwork and tactics, until superior aircraft like the Hellcat could come along. These tactics were first trialed by the Navy F-4Fs at Midway, but were not used by the Marine Buffaloes. The Marines were also outnumbered and their opponents were more experienced. Had the Marines been using the tactics and teamwork they'd adopt shortly after Midway, the fight might have been a little less one-sided. In the meantime, remember that first production run of F-2A1s? 54 planes were ordered, but only 11 deliveries were accepted before the Navy decided to shift the rest of the contract to the F-2A2. But the production run wasn't stopped. Instead, the remaining F-2A1s were denavalized and shipped to Finland, where they did to the Soviets what the Zeros had done to the F-2A3s.
What every Finn feels in his heart is put into words by the Finnish minister in America, Hjalmar Prokope.
Russia has attacked Finland. This is not a war, but the most ruthless aggression upon a peace-loving, hard-working, and deeply religious people.
In 1939, with war looming over Europe, Finland found itself in a precarious position. Finland had been a puppet state of Russia since 1809, but had declared independence during the chaos of the Russian Revolution in 1917. Now Stalin was eyeing it as the rightful property of Russia in need of Russification, and he was making a series of increasingly aggressive demands. Something about that sounds familiar, doesn't it? The Finnish government realized that their air forces were hopelessly out of date and looked for a quick purchase of aircraft from foreign powers. Almost anything would do as long as it could be delivered quickly and would run on their 87-octane fuel. Finland was in negotiations with the United States to authorize the sale of Buffaloes when Russia invaded on November 30th with what was on paper an overwhelmingly superior force in what became known as the Winter War. 2 days later, the U.S. government authorized the sale of the Buffaloes. The Buffaloes, designated B-239, arrived in early 1940, but they had no chance to see combat before a peace treaty was signed in March, as the Finns had managed to hold back the superior Russian forces. The B-239 replaced the Fokker D-21 and were seen by the Finns as a vast upgrade. Finnish ace Eino Juutilainen said it was agile, had good weaponry, 1762 and 3 12.7 machine guns, and an armored pilot seat. It was so much better than the Fokker that it was in another category. If we had had Brewsters during the Winter War, the Russians would have been unable to fly over Finland. It wasn't only by comparison with the old Fokkers that the Brewsters shined. See, these Finnish Buffaloes were the original light, nimble F2A1s, and in fact they were made even lighter by being stripped of their resting hooks, landing gear, crash plates, and catapult hooks. When hostilities between Russia and Finland resumed in June 1941 in what became known as the Continuation War, the Buffalo showed what its original configuration could do. In its very first combat engagement, the Buffalo shot down 5 aircraft to 0 losses. In addition to being the best possible version of a Buffalo, in the early war, the B-239 faced aircraft against which it was well matched. Against planes like the I-153 Cheka, the I-16, and the Hurricane, the Buffalo was either equal or superior. For instance, against the Cheka, the Buffalo's advantage in speed allowed it to dictate the fight. Lauri Nissinen described a fight in which he engaged in a turn fight with the Cheka, and repeatedly broke off, dove, and extended away, then came back for a head-on pass. He got 2 Chekas, one by holding its engine in a head-on, and the second when it declined the head-on and ran, he easily caught it and shot it from behind. Conversely, the British-built Hurricane, lend-lease to the Russians, was superior to the Buffalo in speed, but the Buffalo was a little more agile. Heimo Lampi describes a fight between 8 Buffaloes and 12 Hurricanes, in which, at the beginning, the Hurricanes fought hard, but once they began fleeing, they did not even bother to dodge, but only tried to reach their base as quickly as possible. 8 Hurricanes were shot down to no Buffalo losses. As the war continued, the Buffalo began to face more modern Soviet aircraft, such as the Yak-1. That didn't stop the Buffaloes from shooting them down, especially in situations in which their speed advantage was reduced as they escorted slower IL-2s. In one engagement, on April 18, 1943, 13 Buffaloes intercepted 8 IL-2s and 50 fighters, and shot down 2 IL-2s and 18 fighters, with no losses. The Finns were so enamored with the Buffalo that they even tried to recreate it. Since no more aircraft were obtainable from the US, maybe they could just build their own. So they did, the VL Humu. It's a fascinating prototype, with wings made of wood due to the scarcity of metal, and an engine and instrument panels repurposed from captured Soviet aircraft. Unfortunately, it ended up being more than 500 pounds heavier than the Buffalo, and the Soviet engine was underpowered, making the Humu more akin to the F-2A3 than the beloved B-239. Plans to put the Humu into production were scrapped, but the prototype survives and is viewable today at the Finnish Air Force Museum in Tikkakoski. In 1943, new opponents such as the LA-5 and Yak-7 appeared in Finnish skies. These aircraft were substantially superior to the Buffalo, leading frontline Finnish fighter squadrons to finally replace the plane with Bf-109Gs from Germany. But the Buffalo remained in service with rear squadrons for the duration of the Continuation War. In the follow-on Lapland War in 1944, in which Finland fought their former co-belligerents Nazi Germany and expelled them from Finland, the B-239 Buffalo put the final punctuation mark on its incredible combat record by shooting down 2 Ju-87s. So, why was the B-239 Buffalo so successful? Well, we've already seen that this model of plane was actually quite capable when compared to its early war opponents. Another factor is its suitability to the type of fighting that occurred in the Continuation War. The Soviets did not often make use of high-altitude heavy strategic bombers, but relied instead on mid-altitude medium tactical bombers like the Tu-2 and the IL-4, and attack aircraft like the famous IL-2 and the twin-engine dive-bombing PE-2. These aircraft, and the fighters escorting them, were encountered well within the speed and altitude comfort range of the B-239. It was only when fighters of notably superior speed, such as the LA-5, arrived that the Buffalo found itself unequal to the situation. A third factor of the B-239's success is undoubtedly the quality of its pilots. It appears that the Finns were very good pilots, or maybe the Soviets were quite bad, or both. As evidence for the quality of the Finnish pilots, consider this. The premier Finnish frontline fighter squadron, WWII 24, shot down 120 Soviet aircraft in the Winter War of 1939 to a loss of only 9 planes, while flying the fixed-gear Fokker D-21. Granted, the bulk of those victories were bombers, with only 20 fighters down because the Fokker was recognized as too inferior to engage fighters, and so the pilots were ordered to concentrate on the bombers and try to avoid getting caught in fighter-on-fighter combat. This probably explains Aino Utilainen's comment that if they'd had Buffaloes, the Russians would have been unable to fly over Finland. Once they did have Buffaloes, they were able to engage the fighters directly. But it's still evident that the Finns were excellent pilots, and this continued to be true throughout the war. In fact, Aino Utilainen is the highest scoring non-German ace of World War II with 94 kills. 34 of those kills were in the Buffalo. All told, the lowly Brewster Buffalo, in its B-229 model flown by the Finns against Soviet Russia, destroyed 496 aircraft to a loss of only 19. And yes, those numbers seem to be accurate. The article Finland's Flying Buffaloes in World War II magazine states, while claims of aerial victories are frequently inflated by both sides during war, Russian archives open since the collapse of the Soviet Union tend to confirm that the strict Finns actually underclaim slightly. I want to end with this. One of the most effective ways to start an internet flame war is to make some kind of absolute claim that something is the best or the worst in some category. And there have been flame wars about fighter planes for as long as there's been an internet. So, for anyone already composing their detailed rebuttal, slow down, take a deep breath. There are all sorts of metrics by which to measure what fighter plane is the best, and I'm not really interested in making that sort of a claim. The real world is too nuanced to be so easily categorized, which I suppose is why there's always fuel for those sorts of arguments. But what I do find interesting is just this fascinating and little known story of an aircraft that can be legitimately viewed simultaneously as one of the worst and one of the best fighter planes of World War II.